Omaha, Nebraska, summer 1901. Thomas Webb wiped the sweat from his brow as he adjusted the large format camera on its tripod. At 32, he had established himself as Omaha's premier photographer, his studio on Farnham Street drawing clients from across Douglas County. Today, however, he wasn't in his climate-controlled studio, but rather on a grassy hilltop overlooking the sprawling city below. "Are you certain this is necessary, Mr. Webb?" called Elijah Morton, Thomas's apprentice, struggling with the heavy wooden case containing additional glass plates. The 17-year-old boy had been working for Thomas for just 3 months and still questioned the photographer's occasionally eccentric methods. "Absolutely necessary," Thomas replied without looking up from his viewfinder. The Omaha Daily Herald wants a panoramic view of the city for their anniversary edition, and this vantage point gives us exactly what they need. The summer heat was oppressive, but what concerned Thomas more was the darkening sky to the west. Nebraska thunderstorms could develop with frightening speed, and the last thing he wanted was to have his expensive equipment drenched. "We'll need to work quickly," he muttered, more to himself than to Elijah. "Those clouds don't look friendly." As if on cue, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the prairie. Elijah glanced nervously at the horizon where dark, anvil-shaped clouds were building, their undersides an unnatural greenish-grey. "Perhaps we should return tomorrow, sir?" the boy suggested, his voice cracking slightly. Thomas shook his head. "The deadline is tomorrow morning. It's now or never." He finished adjusting the camera and stepped back. "Hand me the first plate." Working with practiced efficiency, Thomas prepared to take the first of several exposures that would later be combined into a panoramic view. The wind was picking up now, carrying with it the metallic scent of rain. "Hold the tripod steady," Thomas instructed as he ducked beneath the black cloth to check the composition one final time. That's when he saw it. At first, Thomas thought it was a smudge on the lens, or perhaps a flaw in the glass plate. But as he adjusted the focus, the anomaly became clearer. High in the sky, partially obscured by the gathering storm clouds, was a shape that had no business being there. It was roughly circular, but with protrusions that reminded Thomas of the tentacles of an octopus he had once seen at a traveling exhibition. He blinked hard, certain he was mistaken. When he looked again, the shape was still there, and if anything, it seemed closer. "Sir, are we taking the photograph?" Elijah asked, struggling to keep the heavy tripod steady in the gusting wind. Thomas emerged from beneath the cloth, his face pale. "Did you see anything unusual in the sky just now?" Elijah squinted upward. "Just the storm, sir, and it's coming fast." Thomas ducked back under the cloth. The shape was definitely still there, and now he could see what appeared to be a central mass within the circle, darker than the surrounding clouds. As he watched, horrified yet transfixed, the mass seemed to pulse like a giant pupil dilating. "It's watching me," he thought, a cold shiver running down his spine despite the summer heat. Another crack of thunder, closer now, startled Thomas back to his senses. Making a split-second decision, he exposed the plate. "Pack everything up," he ordered Elijah, his voice tight. "We're leaving immediately." The boy, sensing his employer's sudden anxiety, didn't argue. They worked quickly, disassembling the camera and storing the exposed plate with great care. The first fat droplets of rain began to fall as they loaded the equipment onto their wagon. As Thomas took the reins, he couldn't resist one last glance at the sky. The strange shape was gone, or at least hidden by the now churning storm clouds. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been up there was still watching somehow. 3 days later, Thomas sat alone in his darkroom, staring at the print he had just developed. The panorama had come out beautifully, the sprawling city of Omaha captured in perfect detail, from the imposing city hall to the smoke-belching factories along the Missouri River. The Herald would be pleased, but Thomas wasn't looking at the city. His eyes were fixed on the sky above it. There, exactly where he had seen it through his viewfinder, was the shape. In the photograph, it was much clearer than it had appeared to his naked eye, a circular mass with radiating appendages hovering above the city like some monstrous jellyfish. And in its center was what could only be described as an eye, large, dark, and undeniably focused downward. Thomas's hands trembled as he lifted the print closer to the red safe light. He was a rational man, a man of science and technology. There had to be an explanation, a double exposure perhaps, or a flaw in the emulsion. But he knew with a certainty that chilled him to his core that the photograph showed exactly what had been there that day. A knock at the darkroom door made him jump. "Mr. Webb, the Herald's messenger is here for the panorama," Elijah's voice called through the door. Thomas looked down at the print again. After a moment's hesitation, he reached for his scissors and carefully trimmed the top portion of the photograph, removing the strange shape from the sky. "Coming?" he called back, quickly rinsing the trimmed print and hanging it to dry. The excised piece of photograph he slipped into his vest pocket. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The storm that had threatened during their photography session had become one of the worst in Omaha's recent history, with lightning striking several buildings downtown and wind tearing roofs from houses in the poorer districts. As rain lashed against his bedroom window, Thomas sat at his desk, examining the trimmed portion of the photograph under a magnifying glass. The more he studied it, the more convinced he became that what he was looking at was not a photographic anomaly, but something real. Something that had been there, in the sky above Omaha. Something that had been watching. A particularly violent thunderclap shook the house, and the lights flickered momentarily. Thomas glanced up at his window, suddenly certain he would see the same shape silhouetted against the stormy sky. But there was nothing there except rain and darkness. Returning to the photograph, he noticed something he had missed before. Around the edges of the eye-like center, there appeared to be a pattern, not random, but structured, like writing. He squinted, trying to make sense of the markings, but they resembled no alphabet he had ever seen. Thomas reached for a clean sheet of paper and began to sketch what he saw, enlarging the strange symbols. As he worked, a sense of unease grew within him. What if the thing in the sky, whatever it was, had noticed him noticing it? What if, by capturing its image, he had somehow drawn its attention? The idea was absurd, of course, and yet, as another flash of lightning illuminated his room, Thomas could not shake the feeling that he was being watched. The next morning, Thomas awoke at his desk, his neck stiff and his mouth dry. He had eventually fallen asleep while studying the photograph, and now the bright sunlight streaming through his window made the previous night's fears seem foolish. Still, he carefully placed the photographic fragment and his sketches of the strange symbols in a manila envelope, which he then locked in his desk drawer. He would seek a rational explanation. Perhaps Professor Harris at Creighton University, who had an interest in astronomical phenomena, might have some insights. After a quick breakfast, Thomas headed to his studio. The streets of Omaha were littered with debris from the storm, broken branches, roof tiles, and in some places toppled chimneys. The city had taken a beating, but Omahans were resilient folk. Already, people were out sweeping sidewalks and repairing damage. As Thomas rounded the corner onto Farnham Street, he stopped dead in his tracks. A crowd had gathered outside his studio, and even from a distance he could see that something was wrong. Quickening his pace, he pushed through the onlookers to find the front window of his shop shattered, glass fragments glittering on the sidewalk. "Mr. Webb!" Elijah rushed toward him, his young face pale with shock. "It happened during the storm. Lightning, they say, though no one actually saw it strike." Thomas surveyed the damage with a sinking heart. Not only was the window destroyed, but it appeared that water had flooded in afterward, damaging much of the front room of the studio. Framed photographs that had hung on the walls lay in sodden heaps on the floor, their images already blurring and fading. As he stepped carefully through the wreckage, something caught his eye, a pattern in the way the glass had shattered. It radiated outward from a central point, like the appendages of the thing he had photographed in the sky. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. It couldn't be a coincidence. Somehow, the thing in the photograph had found him, had marked his business. "Mr. Webb, are you all right?" Elijah was at his side, concern evident in his voice. Thomas couldn't bring himself to share his irrational thoughts. "Yes, just shocked. We'll need to board up the window and salvage what we can." As they worked through the morning, Thomas kept his fears to himself, but his eyes frequently darted to the clear blue sky above, searching for any sign of the watching entity. By midday, they had cleaned up the worst of the mess, and a glazier had been summoned to measure for a new window. Thomas sent Elijah to purchase supplies they would need to restore the damaged photographs, and found himself alone in the studio for the first time that day. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. Thomas moved to his workroom at the back of the studio, intending to check if his cameras and other equipment had escaped damage. The door to the workroom was ajar, which was strange. Thomas was certain he had locked it the night before. Pushing it open cautiously, he peered inside. Everything appeared to be in order, until his eyes fell on his work table. There, in the center, lay a glass photographic plate, a plate that Thomas was certain he had not left there. With trembling hands, he lifted it to the light. It was exposed, but undeveloped. Without conscious thought, Thomas found himself preparing the chemicals needed to develop the plate. A part of his mind screamed at him to stop, to break the plate, to run from the studio and never return. But a stronger compulsion drove him forward. In the dim red light of his makeshift darkroom, Thomas watched as an image slowly emerged on the plate. It was the interior of his bedroom, specifically a view of Thomas himself, asleep at his desk the night before, the fragment of the photograph visible beneath his slumped form. The perspective was from above, as if someone or something had been hovering near the ceiling looking down at him. Thomas staggered backward, knocking over a bottle of fixer that shattered on the floor. His heart pounded in his chest as the implications hit him. It had been in his home. It had watched him sleep. And somehow, impossibly, it had taken a photograph. The sound of the bell above the studio's front door jangled, announcing Elijah's return. Thomas quickly rinsed the plate and hid it in a drawer before composing himself and returning to the front of the studio. "I've brought the materials you requested, sir," Elijah said, setting down several packages. He looked at Thomas with concern. "Are you unwell? You look as if you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," Thomas muttered, then shook his head. "It's nothing, just the stress of the damage. Listen, Elijah, I need to attend to some personal business this afternoon. Can you continue with the cleanup here?" The boy nodded eagerly, always happy to be trusted with responsibility. Thomas gathered his coat and hat, pausing at the door. "And Elijah, if anyone comes asking about the panoramic photograph we took the other day, anyone at all, tell them nothing. Understand?" Confusion crossed the apprentice's face, but he nodded again. "Yes, sir. Though I don't see why anyone would—" "Just do as I say," Thomas cut him off more sharply than he'd intended. Softening his tone, he added, "Please, it's important." With that, he hurried out into the bright afternoon sunlight, his mind racing. He needed answers, and he knew of only one person in Omaha who might be able to help him make sense of what was happening. Professor William Harris's office at Creighton University was cluttered with books, papers, and various scientific instruments. The elderly academic peered at Thomas over the top of his wire-rimmed spectacles, his bushy white eyebrows drawn together in concentration as he examined the photographic fragment. "Most unusual," he murmured, adjusting the magnifying glass through which he was studying the image. "And you say this appeared in the sky during yesterday's storm?" "Just before it," Thomas corrected, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. He had not told the professor about the developed plate he had found in his studio, or his growing conviction that the entity in the photograph was somehow stalking him. Such claims would sound like the ravings of a madman. Professor Harris set down the magnifying glass and leaned back in his creaking chair. "I've studied atmospheric phenomena for 30 years, Mr. Webb, and I've never seen anything like this. He tapped the photograph with one gnarled finger. "These appendages, they appear to be moving, do they not? There's a blur to them, suggesting motion during the exposure." Thomas nodded. "Yes, they seem to be undulating, like the tentacles of an octopus. And this central portion, you described it as an eye?" "It reminded me of one, yes." Thomas hesitated. "Professor, do you think this could be some kind of living organism? Something that exists in our atmosphere?" The professor's initial smile of dismissal faded as he considered the question more seriously. "The atmosphere is largely unexplored, Mr. Webb. We know there are currents and winds at different altitudes, but as for what might exist up there," he shrugged. "Science is constantly discovering new species on Earth. Who's to say what might live above us?" He leaned forward again, studying the photograph with renewed interest. These markings around the central eye, they appear deliberately patterned, almost like writing. Thomas finished for him. "That's what I thought too." Professor Harris looked up sharply. "May I keep this for further study? I have colleagues in the astronomy department who might have insights." Thomas hesitated. Part of him wanted to snatch back the photograph and destroy it, to sever whatever connection it had created between himself and the entity. But another part, the rational scientist in him, wanted answers. "You may keep it for 2 days," he said finally. "Then I must have it back." The professor nodded, carefully placing the fragment in an envelope. "I'll treat it with the utmost care." "And Mr. Webb?" His eyes, magnified by his thick glasses, were serious. "Whatever this is, I would advise caution. If it is indeed some form of atmospheric life, its intentions toward us are unknown." Thomas left the university with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had shared his burden, but the professor's words had only confirmed his fears. The thing in the sky was real and potentially dangerous. As he walked through the bustling streets of downtown Omaha, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He found himself constantly glancing upward, scanning the clear blue sky for any sign of the circular entity. The rational part of his mind told him he was being paranoid, that even if the thing existed, it was unlikely to be following one insignificant photographer around Omaha. But then, how had it found his studio? How had it entered his home and taken that impossible photograph? Lost in these troubling thoughts, Thomas almost collided with a newsboy on the corner of 16th and Douglas. "Extra, extra! Strange lights reported over Omaha during storm," the boy shouted, waving a copy of the evening edition of the Omaha World Herald. Thomas froze, then fumbled in his pocket for a coin. "I'll take one." The front-page headline confirmed his worst fears. "Mysterious aerial phenomenon witnessed during tempest." According to the article, several citizens had reported seeing unusual lights in the sky during the previous night's storm. One witness, a night watchman at the train depot, described a circular object with writhing appendages, illuminated by lightning. Others spoke of a glowing eye in the clouds. Thomas leaned against a lamppost, suddenly dizzy. It wasn't just after him then. Others had seen it. It was real, and it was here in Omaha. The article went on to quote a Professor James Roberts from the University of Nebraska, who dismissed the sightings as mass hysteria induced by the extreme electrical activity of the storm. The newspaper itself seemed to favor the explanation that the witnesses had simply observed an unusual lightning formation, perhaps a rare type of ball lightning. But Thomas knew better. And now it seemed so did others in Omaha. He folded the newspaper and continued walking, his mind racing. If the entity had been seen by multiple witnesses, perhaps he wasn't its specific target after all. Perhaps its appearance above his photography location had been mere coincidence, but that didn't explain the glass plate in his studio or the strange pattern of destruction. As he approached his home on South 24th Street, Thomas noticed a carriage parked outside, Professor Harris's. The elderly academic was standing on his porch, engaged in animated conversation with a man Thomas didn't recognize. Quickening his pace, Thomas called out, "Professor, what brings you here?" Both men turned. The professor's face was ashen, his usual composed demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "Mr. Webb," he said, his voice tight, "this is Dr. Frederick Jameson from Johns Hopkins University. He happened to be in Omaha giving a lecture on atmospheric electricity when I consulted him about your photograph." The stranger stepped forward, a tall, gaunt man with piercing blue eyes and a closely trimmed beard. "Mr. Webb," he said, extending a hand, "I believe we need to talk. Urgently." Inside Thomas's modest home, the three men sat in the parlor, an uncomfortable silence hanging between them. Finally, Dr. Jameson spoke. "Professor Harris showed me your photograph, Mr. Webb. It is remarkably similar to something I observed in Baltimore approximately 6 months ago." Thomas leaned forward. "You saw this creature too?" "Creature?" Jameson repeated the word thoughtfully. "Yes, perhaps that is what we're dealing with, though I hesitate to anthropomorphize it too much." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper, which he handed to Thomas. "I made this sketch at the time. I'm no artist, but I believe it captures the essence of what I observed." Thomas unfolded the paper with trembling hands. The drawing, though crude, was unmistakably of the same entity he had photographed, a circular mass with tentacle-like appendages and a central eye-like structure. Around the eye, Jameson had carefully drawn the same strange symbols Thomas had noticed. "You've seen these markings?" Thomas asked, pointing to the symbols. Jameson nodded grimly. "Yes, and I've been trying to decipher them ever since. I believe they may be some form of communication." "Communication," Professor Harris interjected. "You think this thing is trying to communicate with us?" "Or about us," Jameson said quietly. "After my sighting, there were a series of incidents in Baltimore. People claiming to be watched. Unusual patterns of destruction, primarily affecting scientific institutions and those who had witnessed the entity." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "My studio was damaged in last night's storm. The glass shattered in a pattern similar to the creature's appendages." Jameson nodded, unsurprised. "It begins that way. Subtle signs escalating gradually." "Escalating to what?" Thomas demanded, his voice rising slightly. The doctor met his gaze steadily. "In Baltimore, 3 people disappeared. All had reported seeing the entity. All had attempted to document or study it in some way." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. "Why are you in Omaha, Dr. Jameson?" Thomas finally asked. "It seems like quite a coincidence that you would be here just as this thing appears." A sad smile crossed the doctor's face. "Not a coincidence at all, Mr. Webb. I've been following it, or perhaps it's been leading me. After Baltimore, there were sightings in Pittsburgh, then Chicago, always accompanying severe electrical storms, always watching, always followed by incidents." "Following it?" Professor Harris looked incredulous. "Why would you do such a thing?" Jameson's expression darkened. "Because it took my wife," he said simply. "Catherine was a photographer, like you, Mr. Webb. She captured the entity on a photographic plate during a lightning storm. 3 days later, she vanished from our home. The only trace—" He paused, visibly composing himself. "The only trace was a damp patch on the ceiling of our bedroom, directly above where she had slept." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. "And you believe this creature took her? How? Why?" "I don't know how," Jameson admitted. "As for why, I can only speculate. But I believe it has something to do with being seen, being photographed, being recorded." He leaned forward intently. "These entities, and I believe there may be more than one, have perhaps existed in our atmosphere for centuries, unseen and unnoticed. But with the advent of photography, with our ability to capture images of the sky in detail, they have been exposed, and they don't like it." The theory was outlandish, verging on the insane, and yet Thomas could not dismiss it. Not after what he had seen, not after the glass plate in his studio. "What do we do?" he asked quietly. Jameson reached into his coat again and withdrew a small leather case. Opening it, he revealed several small metal devices, each about the size of a pocket watch. "I've been developing these," he explained. "They detect unusual electrical activity, the kind that seems to accompany the entity's presence. They've helped me track this one from Chicago to Omaha." He handed one of the devices to Thomas. It consisted of a metal disc with a small glass window in the center, behind which a needle quivered slightly on a calibrated scale. "The needle moves toward the red as the electrical disturbance grows stronger," Jameson explained. "It's crude, but effective." "And once we detect it?" Thomas asked. "What then? How do we fight something that can move through the air, that can apparently enter our homes at will?" Jameson's expression was grim. "I don't know yet, but I'm working on something, a way to perhaps communicate with it, or at least repel it. In the meantime, we need to understand it better. Your photograph, Mr. Webb, is the clearest image anyone has ever captured of one of these entities. It could be the key to understanding what we're dealing with." Thomas thought of the fragment of photograph, now in Professor Harris's possession. "We should retrieve the photograph from your office," he told the professor. "If this thing is targeting those who have evidence of its existence, it's not safe there." Professor Harris nodded, his scholarly skepticism apparently giving way to the reality of the situation. "My office is locked, but yes, we should secure it immediately." As the three men prepared to leave for the university, Thomas noticed the detector Jameson had given him. The needle, which had been quivering slightly near the green portion of the scale, was now moving steadily toward yellow. "Dr. Jameson," he said, his voice tight. "Your detector." The doctor glanced at his own device, then at Thomas's. His face paled. "It's near, and getting closer." Almost in response to his words, the afternoon light suddenly dimmed, as if a cloud had passed over the sun. The three men moved to the window and looked up. The sky, which had been clear blue just moments before, was now churning with dark clouds that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. As they watched, a circular pattern began to form directly above Thomas's house, a swirling vortex of cloud and shadow. "It's coming," Jameson whispered, his voice a mix of fear and anticipation. "After all this time, it's finally coming for me. Not just for you," Thomas said, noticing how the vortex seemed centered precisely over his home. "For all of us." The detector in his hand was now vibrating, its needle buried deep in the red zone. Outside, the wind had picked up dramatically, whistling around the eaves of the house and rattling the windows in their frames. "We need to leave," Professor Harris said urgently. "Now." But as they turned toward the door, a blinding flash of lightning struck the street directly in front of Thomas's house, accompanied by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the very foundations. The lights in the house flickered and died. In the sudden dimness, illuminated only by the eerie glow from outside, Thomas saw the doorknob begin to turn, slowly, deliberately, though no one stood on the other side. The three men stood frozen as the doorknob completed its rotation. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the door swung inward, revealing not the expected view of Thomas's front porch, but a swirling, luminescent mist. "Don't look directly at it," Jameson hissed, shielding his eyes. "That's how it mesmerizes you." Thomas, despite the warning, couldn't tear his gaze away from the mist. Within its swirling depths, he thought he could see images, fleeting glimpses of places he didn't recognize, of skies filled with floating, tentacled entities, of vast, incomprehensible structures that seemed to defy the laws of physics. "The back door," Professor Harris whispered, tugging at Thomas's sleeve. "Quickly!" The three men backed away from the entrancing mist and hurried through the house toward the kitchen and its rear exit. Outside, the storm had intensified, the sky now almost as dark as night despite it being mid-afternoon. Lightning flashed continuously, illuminating the swirling vortex above the house. As they burst through the back door into the garden, Thomas glanced at Jameson's detector. The needle was spinning wildly, the glass cover cracking from the strain. "It's directly above us," Jameson shouted over the howling wind. "We need to split up, confuse it." Thomas wanted to argue, to suggest they stick together, but the doctor was already dashing toward the garden gate, heading east. Professor Harris, after a moment's hesitation, turned west, leaving Thomas standing alone in his back garden, the wind whipping his clothes and hair. Looking up, Thomas saw it, no longer hidden by clouds, but fully visible against the darkened sky. The entity was enormous, far larger than it had appeared in his photograph. Its central eye was open wide, a void of absolute blackness surrounded by the strange symbol-like patterns. The tentacles, which he now saw numbered exactly 12, writhed and twisted in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like a form of sign language. As he stood transfixed, one of the tentacles began to descend toward him, moving through the air with a fluid grace that reminded Thomas of smoke underwater. He knew he should run, but his legs wouldn't obey. Whether from terror or some influence of the entity, he remained rooted to the spot as the tentacle drew closer. Just as the appendage was about to reach him, a gunshot rang out. The tentacle recoiled, and Thomas felt the paralysis lift. Turning, he saw Dr. Jameson at the garden gate, a smoking revolver in his hand. "Run, Webb!" the doctor shouted. "It's vulnerable to sudden shock. The gun won't harm it, but it disrupts its concentration." Thomas didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted toward Jameson, ducking as another tentacle swept through the air where his head had been moments before. "What is it?" Thomas gasped as they ran together down the alley behind his house. "What does it want?" "Knowledge," Jameson panted. "It collects knowledge, and those who possess it." They emerged onto South 24th Street, which was eerily deserted. The storm had driven most people indoors, though Thomas could see faces peering fearfully from windows as they passed. "Where are we going?" Thomas asked as they continued to run, the entity presumably still above his house. "The university," Jameson replied. "Harris will meet us there. I have equipment in my guest room, things I've been developing to fight these creatures." As they ran, Thomas noticed that the sky ahead of them was beginning to darken, the same swirling pattern forming above the university in the distance. "It's tracking us somehow," he said, pointing upward. Jameson followed his gaze and cursed under his breath. "It's faster than I thought. We need to get off the street." They ducked into a narrow space between two buildings, momentarily hidden from the sky above. Jameson pulled out his detector again. The needle was still in the red zone, but no longer spinning. "It knows we're here, but not exactly where," he said. "These buildings are confusing it. Webb, listen to me carefully. You need to get to Harris at the university. Find the photograph. Destroy it." "Destroy it?" Thomas was confused. "I thought you said it was valuable evidence." "It is," Jameson agreed, "but it's also a connection, a tether between you and the entity. As long as it exists, the creature can find you, no matter where you go." "What about you?" Thomas asked, noting the determined look in the doctor's eyes. "I'm going to create a diversion," Jameson said grimly. "Draw it away from you. I've been preparing for this confrontation for months." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small metal sphere, intricately engraved with symbols similar to those surrounding the entity's eye. "What is that?" Thomas asked, fascinated despite his fear. "Something I developed based on my observations of the entities," Jameson explained. "It emits an electrical frequency that seems to attract them. I'm going to lead this one away from the university, away from the photograph." Thomas shook his head. "That's suicide, Doctor." A sad smile crossed Jameson's face. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it's my chance to finally learn what happened to Catherine." He placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Find Harris. Destroy the photograph, and tell people what you've seen, Mr. Webb. They may not believe you, but some will, and they need to be prepared." Before Thomas could argue further, Jameson stepped out of their hiding place and into the street. He held the metal sphere above his head and twisted something on its base. The sphere began to glow with an unearthly blue light. Almost immediately, the swirling vortex above the university changed direction, moving rapidly toward their position. Jameson gave Thomas one last nod, then began running in the opposite direction from the university, the glowing sphere held high. Thomas watched as the vortex followed the doctor, tentacles of cloud reaching down as if trying to grasp him. Then, steeling himself, he emerged from hiding and began running toward the university, staying close to buildings, using their shelter to hide from the sky as much as possible. By the time he reached the Crichton campus, his lungs were burning and his legs felt like lead. The storm had reached the university ahead of him, and rain was now falling in sheets, drenching him to the skin. The campus was deserted, most students and faculty having fled the approaching tempest. Thomas made his way to the science building, where Professor Harris's office was located. Inside, the corridors were dim, lit only by emergency gas lamps that cast eerie shadows on the walls. Thomas climbed the stairs to the second floor, where Harris's office was located, hoping desperately that the professor had made it back safely. The door to the office was ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the dark hallway. Thomas approached cautiously, calling out, "Professor Harris, are you there?" No answer came. Pushing the door open wider, Thomas stepped into the cluttered office and froze in horror. The room had been ransacked. Books and papers were strewn everywhere, shelves overturned, scientific instruments smashed, and on the ceiling, directly above the professor's desk, was a dark, wet stain, perfectly circular, with 12 streaks radiating outward like the tentacles of the entity. Of Professor Harris himself, there was no sign. Thomas's heart sank. The entity had beaten him here, and it had taken the professor just as Jameson had claimed it took his wife and others who had witnessed it. Moving carefully through the devastated office, Thomas searched desperately for the photographic fragment. The envelope in which Harris had placed it was on the desk, torn open and empty. Had the entity taken the photograph as well? Or had Harris managed to hide it before he was taken? Thomas tried to think logically. If the professor had known the entity was coming for him, where would he have hidden the photograph? His eyes scanned the chaos of the office, looking for any clue. They settled on the professor's pride and joy, an antique terrestrial globe that stood in the corner of the office. Unlike the rest of the room, it seemed untouched by the destruction. Moving closer, Thomas noticed something odd. The globe was not properly aligned on its axis. It was slightly askew, as if it had been hastily replaced. With trembling hands, Thomas lifted the globe from its stand. There, taped to the inside of the wooden base, was the envelope containing the photographic fragment. Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by renewed fear. He had the photograph, but now what? The entity had taken Professor Harris. It might already have taken Dr. Jameson as well, and it would surely be coming for him next. As if in response to his thoughts, a low rumbling sound filled the office, and the lights flickered. Outside the window, the sky had turned an unnatural greenish black, and in its depths, Thomas could see the now familiar circular shape forming. He had to destroy the photograph. Jameson had been clear about that. Breaking the connection between himself and the entity was his only hope of survival. Thomas fumbled in his pocket for matches, intending to burn the photograph right there. But as he withdrew the envelope and opened it, he hesitated. Something about the symbols surrounding the entity's eye caught his attention, something he hadn't noticed before. The patterns weren't random. They weren't even alien, as he had first thought. They were mathematical equations, complex ones but recognizable nonetheless. Thomas had always had an aptitude for mathematics, though he'd pursued photography instead of academia. Now, staring at the symbols, he began to understand fragments of what they represented. They were equations describing space, not three-dimensional space as humans understood it, but something more complex. 4, 5, perhaps even more dimensions, folded and intersecting in ways that his mind struggled to comprehend. The entity wasn't communicating, it was calculating, mapping, measuring. Another flash of lightning illuminated the office, closer now, and the building shook with thunder. Thomas knew he had only moments before the entity found him, but destroying the photograph no longer seemed like the answer. Understanding it might be. Making a split-second decision, Thomas pocketed the photograph and ran to the professor's desk. In the chaos of scattered papers, he found what he was looking for, Harris's notebook, where the professor jotted down his observations and theories. Flipping through it frantically, Thomas found the pages where Harris had been analyzing the photograph. The professor had come to similar conclusions as Thomas just had. The symbols were mathematical notations, but Harris had gone further, attempting to decipher their meaning. His notes were fragmented, hasty, but one phrase stood out. Not hostile, curious, studying us as we study them. Another rumble of thunder, and the windows of the office rattled in their frames. Outside, the circular entity was fully visible now, its tentacles reaching toward the building. Thomas had to make a choice, run or try to understand. Understanding won out. If the entity was indeed studying humanity, perhaps communication was possible. Perhaps Jameson was wrong about its intentions. Thomas moved to the window and, in an act of either immense courage or foolishness, opened it wide. Rain and wind immediately whipped into the room, scattering papers and knocking over the few items that had remained upright. "I know what you are!" Thomas shouted into the storm. "I understand your mathematics!" The entity paused, its tentacles freezing in mid-motion. The central eye, that void of absolute darkness, seemed to focus more intently on Thomas. Pulling out the photograph, Thomas held it up toward the entity. "This is you," he called. "We see you. We want to understand you." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, one tentacle extended toward the open window. Not aggressively, but with a deliberate, almost cautious motion. Thomas stood his ground, though every instinct screamed at him to flee. The tentacle stopped just short of the window, hovering in the air. Then, to Thomas's astonishment, it began to change shape, forming itself into a complex, three-dimensional pattern that mirrored the mathematical symbols in the photograph. It was responding, communicating. With shaking hands, Thomas grabbed a piece of chalk from the professor's desk and quickly sketched a simple equation on the windowsill. The Pythagorean theorem, one of the foundational concepts of human mathematics. The entity's tentacle shifted again, reproducing the equation, but then extending it, adding dimensions, complexities that made Thomas's head spin. It was as if the entity was saying, "Yes, but there's so much more." Another tentacle approached, this one moving toward Thomas himself. Fighting his fear, he stood still as it came closer, finally stopping inches from his face. The tentacle began to glow with a soft blue light, similar to the sphere Jameson had used. In that glow, Thomas suddenly saw images, flashes of other places, other times. He saw the skies of ancient Earth, with dozens of the entities floating peacefully above primitive human settlements. He saw them observing, recording, studying the evolution of human civilization with patient curiosity. He saw Professor Harris and others who had been taken, not dead or harmed, but transported to some kind of observation space, a pocket between dimensions where the entities could study human subjects more closely. Harris was there, alive, examining his surroundings with the same academic interest with which the entities examined him. And he saw Jameson's wife, Catherine, communicating with the entities through her photographs, establishing the first real dialogue between the species. She had not been taken against her will. She had gone willingly to learn, to understand. The visions faded, and Thomas found himself still standing in the professor's office, the entity's tentacles still glowing before him. He understood now. They weren't predators or invaders. They were scholars, scientists, explorers, just like humans, but operating on a scale and in dimensions beyond human comprehension. "You want to study us," Thomas said aloud, "and you've allowed yourselves to be seen because you're ready for contact." The tentacle pulsed in what Thomas interpreted as affirmation. But why the destruction, the storm, Why take people? The tentacle shifted, forming new patterns. Thomas couldn't fully understand, but he grasped fragments. The entities didn't cause the storms. They used them, riding the electrical currents like highways. The destruction was unintentional, a side effect of their presence in our dimension. And they didn't take people permanently. They borrowed them, studied them, and would return them, enriched with new knowledge. Another image flashed in Thomas's mind. Jameson, not running in fear as Thomas had assumed, but pursuing the entities with weapons of his own design, based on misunderstood fragments of their mathematics. Jameson had lost his wife, not to abduction, but to her own choice to learn and explore beyond the boundaries of human experience. Unable to accept this, he had turned his brilliant mind to vengeance. "He's trying to hurt you," Thomas realized aloud. "Jameson doesn't understand." The entity's tentacle pulsed again, conveying not fear but concern, not for itself, but for Jameson, for humanity. The doctor's devices, based on incomplete understanding of the entity's nature, were creating instabilities in the barriers between dimensions. If he activated his weapon, whatever it was, the consequences could be catastrophic for both species. Thomas made his decision. "Take me to him," he said, reaching out toward the glowing tentacle. "Let me try to stop him." Indeed, the tentacle wrapped gently around his outstretched hand. There was no sensation of wetness or physical contact, just a tingling, like a mild electrical current. Then the world around Thomas seemed to fold, space bending in impossible ways, and he found himself no longer in the professor's office but standing on the roof of the Omaha Electric Light and Power Company building downtown. Jameson was there, hunched over a complex apparatus of coils, tubes, and spinning metal discs, a device that hummed with increasing power, shooting occasional sparks into the stormy air. The glowing sphere Thomas had seen earlier was mounted at the center, pulsing with an intensifying blue light. Above them, not just one, but several of the circular entities hovered, their tentacles extended downward, trying to reach the device but seemingly unable to approach too closely. "Jameson!" Thomas called over the howl of the wind and the crackle of the machine. The doctor turned, his face illuminated by flashes of lightning and the blue glow of his device. When he saw Thomas, his expression shifted from surprise to suspicion. "How did you get here?" he demanded. "Did they bring you? Have they taken you too, like they took Catherine?" "They didn't take her, Doctor," Thomas replied, approaching cautiously. "She went willingly. They're not our enemies." Jameson's face contorted with rage and grief. "Lies! They've put these thoughts in your head, just as they did with Harris when he started to decipher their symbols." He gestured wildly at the entities above. "They're invaders, Webb, advanced scouts for something worse, and this device will send them a message that Earth is not defenseless." Thomas could feel the energy building in Jameson's machine. The air around it was beginning to distort, like heat waves, but more pronounced, as if reality itself was bending. "Your machine isn't a weapon against them," Thomas tried to explain. "It's tearing at the fabric between dimensions. You could cause irreparable damage to both our world and theirs." "Good!" Jameson spat. "Let them suffer as I have suffered." He turned back to his device, making final adjustments. Thomas looked desperately up at the entities above, silently pleading for help, for guidance. One of them, perhaps the same one that had transported him here, extended a tentacle toward him. In his mind, Thomas saw a vision of the machine's inner workings, the flow of energies through its components, and the one crucial element that could be removed to disable it safely. Without further hesitation, Thomas lunged forward, reaching past Jameson toward the glowing sphere at the machine's heart. The doctor tried to stop him, but Thomas was younger, faster. His fingers closed around the sphere, which burned with cold fire, and he wrenched it free from its mounting. Immediately, the machine's hum changed pitch, dropping from a dangerous whine to a failing groan. Sparks erupted from various components, and the distortion in the air began to subside. "No!" Jameson cried, trying to grab the sphere from Thomas. "Do you know what you've done? It took me months to calculate the precise frequency." But Thomas held the sphere away from the doctor's reaching hands. "I'm saving both our species, Doctor. These beings aren't what you think they are." As if to confirm his words, the entities above began to descend, their tentacles forming complex patterns in the air, patterns that Thomas now recognized as expressions of gratitude, of relief. Jameson backed away, terror replacing rage on his face. "Keep them away from me," he whispered. "Don't let them take me." "They don't want to take you," Thomas assured him. "They want to show you the truth. About them. About Catherine." The name seemed to break something in the doctor. He sank to his knees on the rain-soaked roof, his shoulders shaking with sobs. "Catherine," he moaned. "My Catherine." The entities continued their descent, surrounding the two men in a circle of gently undulating tentacles. The storm was subsiding now, the rain softening to a gentle drizzle, the wind dying down to a whisper. One tentacle reached toward Jameson, glowing with the same blue light that had shown Thomas the visions. The doctor flinched, but did not retreat, as the appendage stopped just before his face. Thomas watched as Jameson's expression changed, from fear to wonder, from grief to hope. The doctor was seeing what Thomas had seen, the truth about the entities, about his wife's choice, about the greater universe beyond human comprehension. When the vision ended, Jameson remained kneeling, tears streaming down his face. But they were no longer tears of grief. "She's alive," he whispered. "She's exploring the cosmos with them, learning things no human has ever known." "Yes," Thomas confirmed, "and you can join her if you wish. Or you can stay and help humanity prepare for a broader understanding of the universe." Jameson looked up at the entities, now floating peacefully above them like strange, magnificent balloons. "All this time," he said, "I thought I was pursuing them, but they were guiding me, leading me toward understanding. Even my machines, they were helping me build them, through dreams, through intuition, though I misunderstood their purpose." He rose to his feet, a new determination in his eyes. "I need to dismantle this device properly," he said. "Ensure it causes no further instability. And then I have much to learn." Thomas smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "We all do, Doctor. We all do." 1 year later, Thomas Webb adjusted his bow tie nervously as he stood before the gathered crowd in the grand hall of the Omaha Public Library. The exhibition, Visitors from Above, a photographic record, had drawn hundreds of curious citizens, as well as scientists, academics, and journalists from across the country. On the walls hung dozens of photographs, all taken by Thomas over the past year, documenting the entities that now regularly appeared in the skies above not just Omaha, but cities worldwide. The images showed the beings in various states and formations, their mathematical communications captured for human study and interpretation. At the center of the exhibition was the original photograph, the one Thomas had taken that stormy day a year ago, the one that had started everything. It was displayed in a special case, alongside notes and translations of its mathematical symbols, painstakingly decoded by Thomas, Professor Harris, who had indeed been returned safely 3 months after his observation, and Dr. Jameson. Speaking of the doctor, Thomas spotted him across the room, deep in conversation with a group of university students. Jameson had become one of the foremost experts on entity communication, developing new technologies to facilitate dialogue between the species. He had not joined his wife in her cosmic explorations, at least not yet, choosing instead to help humanity prepare for this new relationship with their atmospheric neighbors. As Thomas prepared to address the assembled guests, he reflected on how much had changed in a single year. The entities, now commonly called observers by the press, had become a regular, if still awe-inspiring, feature of human life. Their presence had revolutionized mathematics, physics, and astronomy as they shared carefully measured glimpses of their knowledge with their human counterparts. Not everyone had welcomed them, of course. There had been fear, panic, even violence in some quarters. Religious leaders debated their significance. Governments scrambled to establish protocols. Military forces remained wary. But day by day, understanding grew. Dialogue expanded. Trust, tentative but real, began to form. Thomas's thoughts were interrupted as Professor Harris approached the podium, ready to introduce him to the audience. The elderly academic had aged in reverse since his observation, his mind sharper, his eyes brighter, filled with the wonders he had glimpsed beyond human perception. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harris began, his voice strong and clear, "it is my great honor to introduce the man whose courage, curiosity, and compassion opened the door to a new era in human history. A man who looked into the eye of the unknown and saw not an enemy, but a fellow seeker of knowledge, Mr. Thomas Webb." As Thomas took the podium amid enthusiastic applause, he glanced up through the library's domed glass ceiling. There, visible against the evening sky, floated one of the observers, its tentacles forming a pattern that Thomas now recognized as a greeting, an expression of friendship. "1 year ago," Thomas began, "I took a photograph of what I thought was a storm. What I captured instead was a moment of contact, a moment when two species, separated by dimensions rather than mere distance, began to see each other clearly for the first time." He paused, looking out at the eager faces before him. "We have so much to learn from our visitors, and perhaps in our human curiosity, our determination to understand, our willingness to reach across the void toward the unknown, we have something to teach them as well." Outside, more observers were gathering, their circular forms glowing softly in the twilight. A new storm was approaching, not one of destruction, but of discovery. And Thomas Webb, once a simple photographer from Omaha, stood at its eye, ready to document every wondrous moment. As he continued his speech, Thomas thought of the words Professor Harris had written in his notebook that fateful day. "Not hostile, curious, studying us as we study them." How true those words had proven to be. The watchers in the storm had indeed been watching humanity, waiting for the moment when we would finally look up and truly see them in return.